Quad66. Look, we've got twins. Look at that, cute little 1S twins. So one of the issues I had before, so I was trying to compare these Flywoo motors to the Pyrodrone motors, was that I only had one quad with this board. This is that Tune RC board. It's the FPV cycle. The first one they put out, it's the 1S only board. And it's a nice performing board. And to get fair motor comparisons, what I figured out shortly after using that Flywoo board was that I needed the same board. That Flywoo was just not performing at the same level. And that Flywoo, I think it's a Whoop board, it's a 5-amp board. But anyways, one of you viewers out there happened to not be so into 1S and had a barely used Tune RC board and also had some barely used FPV cycle motors, and was offering them at a very, I think reasonable price, and I was like, sure, jump at it. So now I've got quads that I can do back-to-back testing on, and which is nice because this board is currently on a, they don't make it anymore, and I'm not sure if Tune RC will redo another 1S board, dedicated 1S board. But anyways, the first motors I did back-to-back were these FPV cycle 13mm motors. So these are 13, I think they're like an 02.5 or something along those lines. I don't know exactly what they are. But the KV is listed as 112 or 11,250. Yeah, 112 would be a lot of KV. 11,250 KV. And these are 2mm prop shafts, and obviously I had to drill out the props, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But anyways, and with these motors, so these are the green ones. They are now white. I did try and post on the FPV Cycle Facebook forum or Facebook page with a specific question of whether these motors are mechanically identical to the white versions. I had a couple responses saying yes, but Rugi himself did not chime in to confirm that. But as far as I know, I think they're mechanically the same as the current version, but I'm not 100% sure. If anybody knows for sure, please let me know. And so the first comparison I did was with these versus the Flywoo, and the Flywoo is a 1203 motor. And the KV is about the same. I forget exactly what they reported as. I think the same, like 11,500, so essentially the same KV. And here, the prop shafts aren't quite as tight, so I've got to use the screws, so that gives a little bit of an advantage right off the bat to the FPV cycle motor. So my first impressions of these motors, they're really nice, and actually, like when I got them, I was pleasantly surprised that they actually feel pretty notchy, much notchier than the first version, which were like their 1202.5 motor. And so I was kind of optimistic, and flying it, sure enough, this motor actually feels, it addresses the main kind of like feedback or kind of criticism I had, which were the prior motors just felt, they felt a little lazy. They were kind of slow to spool up, and they're easy to fly, but it felt like you're flying a giant like puffy marshmallow. These motors, on the other hand, in the low end of the throttle, they feel super precise. The PID tune actually just feels great on these, and it felt so good to the point where I actually went and started messing with this tune a little bit, because I think there's a little bit more that I could get out of it potentially. But these motors are super easy to fly, especially at lower speeds, and that was really pretty nice to feel. So initial impression when I first flew them, I was like about ready to order another set. But then I slept on it, gave it another day, and flew some more packs. And I think the precision is still there, but then once I started flying these back and forth, some of the things came out of that I'm a little bit less impressed with. And potentially some of it's fixable, some of it's not. One of those things is that this setup feels a little bit more floaty. It feels like it gets a little bit more hung up in the air. I was trying to figure out if that's maybe the camera tilt angle. Now, these are printed in a different color. I think it's the same. I got to double check to make sure it's the same exact version of the print. But I was trying to figure out is this maybe a little bit shallower camera angle than this one, and it might be. I don't know. I might try printing some more to take that out of the equation, or does this one just need a slightly lower dynamic idle? So on the new version of Betaflight 4.3, and man, those sliders are a hot mess for 1S. I think it's fine. I'll talk about that later too, but let's keep talking about the motors first. So I think potentially maybe taking the dynamic idle down a little bit. So currently I have it at 35 and maybe like bumping it down to 30 so that the idle is a little bit lower and maybe get it to fall out of the sky a little bit better. Might help there. Because it does feel like it gets hung up a little bit. Now, on the other hand, the nice part about where it is that at low speeds, this quad just does not hunt at all. Like, so one of the problems with quads, like when you kind of come in low speed, you're kind of like drifting up and down. This one just feels rock solid, and it's like easy to be flying fast and then just come up and like slow down, and then you feel locked in. Like there's no like kind of vertical. It's just really stable. It doesn't feel like the motors are hunting around any, and that was really nice to feel. It's really easy to catch from dives and things like that, and it's very happy flying slow. I think this is actually a fantastic build if you're trying to learn to fly, because this is super easy to fly. And so that's good, but the downside of it is kind of that floaty feeling. Also, these motors, I really don't think they quite have the top end of the Flywoo motor. When I really get into it and try and punch out, it doesn't throw quite as well. And so I think the Flywoo has a little bit more of an advantage there. But anyways, really quite nice motors. The drilling out the props, so that was kind of interesting. I got the little Ruby kit here. One of the things that's interesting is I assume that this piece, I can't figure out what to do with it other than thinking that I think this might have been for holding the drill bit, but then they changed the drill bits, and so now this is just a nice piece of aluminum that is nice color, but I don't know what to do with it. But with drilling out the things, it's a bit of a process. So first with this thing, you got to put this little guide in, and then you drop the prop on top, and this little piece in the center kind of centers the prop. Then once the prop's on there, you've got this other piece with the two little screws, and these little screws come in, and you basically then screw down the motor, and once the prop is screwed down to this jig, then you pull out this little piece, and then you come in from the other side, and then you drill it out. And then obviously you have to unscrew the screws. One of my complaints about that, although it works well, all these drilled out great. The balance felt like it was fine, and the amount of pressure or torque or grip that it has on the prop shaft it's good. It's where it should be, so it works well. My main complaint about this is, and it's not really, I don't know, I mean, maybe this is just what you have to do to get that nice precision of the holes, but I would have thought if you could have had the screws coming up, or like instead of having these button head screws, have like the grub screw style where you could have these already screwed in, and so you just drop the prop on, drop this on, and then just kind of hold it there in place, finger tight or something like that. I'm not sure if it would work as well, but you need a separate Allen wrench to be able to screw these in, and it's a bit of an ordeal. It's a bit of a process, and so with these props in my backyard when I'm bashing them up, go through them pretty fast, and that's kind of a lot of hassle. Now, at the end of the day, is it less hassle than the screws? Using little nylon screws, now I have to cut these down to height, but that's pretty quick. I don't think it's less hassle. I'm not sure. I haven't like timed it. I haven't timed it to compare it back and forth, but I don't know. It works. It's a trade-off. The downside of the prop screws is with Carl Pablo with the thrust testing, we did show that the prop screws actually decrease the efficiency and thrust. So these little nubs hanging out the top, that is enough to change the performance of the motor. So if you can do it without the prop screws, it is better on a purely performance standpoint. And these props are holding on well. They're not going anywhere, and so that's pretty nice. So going to the Flywoo motor. Now, so after flying the FPV cycle motor and being able to fly them really back to back, that really highlights the differences or the different personalities in this motor. This motor is definitely a little less happy in the low end of the throttle. So when I'm just kind of like, when you punch up go to 0 throttle and just do a snap roll to kind of test the PID tune and things like that. This one isn't quite as crisp as the FPV cycle. This Flywoo motor is not quite as crisp in that regard. It's also when you're kind of just slowly like cruising around, these motors just, I don't think they're not feeling quite as locked in, and it's to the point where I was actually experimenting with actually pushing up the P and the I a little bit on it, or what Betaflight now refers to as like sort of the tracking gains. And I have some more experimentation to do, but where these motors really come into their own is when you start getting after the throttle. These have enough punch to where, especially on the bigger cell, when I'm flying them on the 720 cell, these have enough punch to where I'm like, oh, wow, this is 1S. Like it's like, it kind of puts a little smile on your face with how much power you can get out of 1S these days. It's like, wow, that's pretty good. And it makes you question, like, really, do you need 2S? But, and this quad overall, it flies better when you're getting after it. So if you're kind of being slow and lazy with it, it's just, the motors seem to be a little less happy down the lower end of the throttle range. But once you get into the throttle, these motors really come alive. And it's actually, if you're aggressive, this quad gets, as you're more aggressive, this quad actually gets easier to fly. The FPV cycle motor, it's basically, it's not harder to fly when you're flying aggressive, but it's more that it's just consistent. Like it flies equally as well when you're kind of flying a little bit slower, a little bit lazier versus when you're getting more aggressive. But when you try and really get aggressive and throw this quad, it just doesn't have that same, this just has this little extra gear at the top end where it's like, wow, it has a little bit of a pop to it at the top where you're just like, wow, that's kind of impressive for 1S, I gotta admit. And as you get into after a little bit and you're flying more aggressively, you can just kind of throw it more, sling it around more. The tune does feel a little bit looser. I think there might be something to work on there, but it might also be just kind of the motor and the personality of the motor. The power band just, I think it's just a little different, and it's not surprising. This is a 13 something kind of short, flat, pancake-ish motor, and this is a taller motor, and so you expect that the taller motor, the power band's going to move up versus the shorter, flatter motor. It's going to be a narrower power band, and so if the KV is the same, the power band on the 1203 is going to be wider. It's going to be a little higher. And the 130, just call it 1302.5 for just to call it something, is going to be a little bit narrower and it's going to be a little lower. So it's just differences. Now I'm going to fly this some more because I kind of want to decide, like, do I want to buy some of these motors, get some of the white ones. This is just this is an unfortunate mess of colors here. Also, when I bought these, I wasn't really thinking, but these had already been mounted, so the wires were a little short and I had to do some extra, you can see this little extra work. And so I actually pulled some wire off the, those are those Pyrodrone Hyperlight motors. So I had to extend the wires, which is a little bit annoying, but at the end of the day, it's not a big deal. The other thing on batteries, to me, the flight performance, the quad, the way it flew, this was a little bit less sensitive to the battery versus the 1203 just seemed to get happier when you throw more battery at them. So with the bigger cell, that 720 red pack versus the yellow 6 something, whatever it is, that red pack, these motors are just happier. They just have, they are willing to take more power and do more work with it. Versus I didn't feel as much benefit as going up to the bigger cell with this. In terms of overall efficiency, you would think this motor is has a little less top end. Maybe it's going to be a little bit more efficient. I wasn't really necessarily seeing that. I was flight time wise, I was getting about the same out of it. And that's not super precise. I mean, I'm sure you can find some difference on a thrust stand in terms of the power efficiency, but in my backyard flying, you know, I've gone through, between the two of them, I don't know, probably not a ton of cells, but maybe like 12, like six packs each. I haven't really noticed one jumping out different than the other. What was I going to say? Oh, I'll do another video because it's a bit of flight 4.3. It looks like they're getting ready to release it, so it's basically time to do a video on it. The sliders, I think the sliders are fine when you have a quad that's close enough to a 5-inch tune, but with these 1S quads, the new way the sliders work, the sliders make you think you're doing something ridiculous, and I'll show you that when we get into that, but that was kind of funny. So, first impressions. I think, especially at low speeds, I think these FPV cycle motors, I think their PID response is a little bit better, and that leads to more precision, particularly at slower speeds. It lacks just a little bit of top end, so it's got a little extra float to it, and it doesn't toss around quite as well. Probably, I wouldn't say probably, I'd say definitely, this is the better beginner motor, or last advanced pilot motor. It's easier to fly. I think it truly is. Flywheel motor, this is the fun one. It's a little bit, it takes a little bit more, but I think it also gives back a little bit more in terms of, I find it just a little bit more fun to fly. But, so next rounds, what I'm going to do is, so obviously I got to get that power drone, the hyperlight motor here in the mix too, so I'm going to have to pull some motors. Unfortunately, I don't have triplets. That would have been, I don't know, that'd be a little bit ridiculous. But so I got to pull that motor off, and I'll decide which one to compare it to first. And so then we'll do another video with those, and then change it out one more time. And we'll have another video after that, and kind of wrap it up and see if I can make some conclusions. But that's my first impressions. I'm actually really curious to compare these to the hyperlight motors, because I think they actually, even though these are wide and flat, my recollection of the hyperlights is that I think this flies more similar to the hyperlights, which is kind of weird, just based on the dimensions of the motor. But we'll see if it pans out now that I have the ability to fly these motors back to back. So, all right, till next time, cheers.